Hello, Victoria.
How are you?
Doing well.
It's
Okay,
so
Chris, I see Dr.
great.
Hawkins has joined us, but I figured out how to start the recording, so you are welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Alrighty, so do I need to share my screen because I have like this whole 21 slide PowerPoint that I just made?
Yes, please. You should be able to do that.
All right, that's great. Let me get all of this settled. Turn camera off. Okay, there we go. Well, boy. Just tell me when you guys can see it.
We can see it.
We can see it. It looks beautiful. You're going to do so great. You're going to do so fantastic. I'm so excited. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Alrighty, so let me actually remember how to do a slideshow because I'm alrighty, well, this is my final project for Donaghy. I had decided to sort of follow a creative impulse that I have been entertaining for the last 5-6 years, which is the application of Latin in the context of music. This is actually something that really speaks to the heart of my interest in this particular language. And so I'll just be going over briefly what the background for this specific project was and the methodology that I went through in order to bring it to this stage of completion, and detailing you also some of the insight that goes into the actual translation of each song. So we'll get into that a bit more. So that's what I'm basically summarizing what I just said, covering what I will be covering today, the background of the project, the actual problem that I was trying to address, the methods that I took in order to solve that problem, and then I'll be going through a little bit of a description of each of the songs that I managed to translate in this process. I'll wrap up with some concluding points, and if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. So yeah. And so the background of this particular project, many of you probably already know this because I've talked about it a lot over the years, but I am very interested in the Latin language. The reasons for this, there's a variety of reasons, to be frank. Part of this has to do with an interest that revolved around the fictional series of Rick Riordan. And so I was sort of drawn into my interest in Rome because of a sort of dramatic irony that I felt. I was aware of both the Greek and Roman mythology traditions. And in this particular story, you normally follow the Greek tradition. And so the Roman camp ends up getting sort of portrayed in a sort of mystical, unknown light. And so I started to lean into that curiosity, that mystique, and I continued to apply it in a variety of different contexts. I started this process when I was around 10th grade. And so I continued to specifically apply Latin in the context of music. I was fascinated with playing with antiquity. As I continued to develop this interest, I started to translate songs that were emotionally salient to me. And in that process, I started to become even more fascinated with this idea of making the sentiments that were near and dear to my heart, be that through R&B, variety of songs, a bit more personal, but then also giving them a sort of ancient pedigree by imagining maybe some Roman child saying these same things to someone that was significant to him. So for example, translating a song for Mama, imagining a Roman boy saying that to his mother, and how the poetics of that particular language would pan out to really express those concepts. And then my obsession became even more validated as I met a community of, we call ourselves Esquidites, which is a community of Latin and ancient Greek speakers. And so I continued to be encouraged to delve further and further into this interest of mine, which is end up being the background of this particular problem today. So the problem that I had initially when I started to take on this particular project was I didn't necessarily want to get into the politics of how to teach a language properly, because I didn't want to necessarily jump into the rabbit hole of maybe reviving the language, because Latin is known as a dead language officially. And so my interest, my goal, plain and simple, was to just share my interest in the language, just apply it in the context of songs and sort of put these songs out there and see who would like them. So I had a very broad audience in mind. I did have some academic undertones in that I knew that instructors might find these particular songs useful in the context of their lessons. But I still had this idea of maybe capturing some people who were in maybe the non-Latin speaking community. And disculpa también, yo tengo que explicar esto porque esto, yo no sé, porque hay algunas personas que también pueden hablar en español y yo puedo explicar un poco de lo que estoy hablando también después, si hay otra duda. Entonces, but what ended up happening was that my pragmatic concerns as well were oriented around choosing songs that were in my range, things that might be broadly popular, and I continued on that sort of track as I initially started to write down the translations. But one of the big problems that I ended up running into was exemplified with the song Havana, is that I started to just write out translations of the songs without any sort of modifications. I was trying to convey the concepts, the narrative of each song as truthfully as I possibly could, as close to the original as I possibly could. But there are certain cultural references that wouldn't necessarily work as well in Latin, at least through my initial judgment. So if we go through the song Havana, where we have a lot of references to, for example, Cuban slang like La Yuma, which is a word that's specifically meaning the United States, but in the context of Cuban slang. Or when you have even the first line of, in the English version, which is, he didn't walk in with that how you do, and that is possibly a reference to the character Joey in Friends, and such a specific reference, loading all of that context into a translation in Latin, in which Cuba didn't necessarily exist during the classical period, nor did Friends. I started to see that as being a little bit difficult. So what I would do in those moments where there might be some sort of concept or cultural signaling that wasn't necessarily as easy to translate, I would start to interject my own sort of narrative into the story of the song. And that's where the problem that I was addressing, that's where the goal that I was initially setting out to accomplish started to shift a little bit. So this does still kind of go back to the initial interest that I did have in Latin. So when I said that I would oftentimes have this fascination with expressing a given sentiment in Latin that was very close to me, that was very strong to me, there's a certain level where that interest revolves around an enactment of a Roman identity, but it's a very internal process. So in the context of this particular album, I'm imagining at the very least that this would be going out to a larger Quiris audience. I'm starting to, with the interest in actually experimenting with the poetics of the language, I'm ending up starting to already personalize the words that I'm using in the song. I'm already giving myself permission to vary a little bit the lyrics in order to more faithfully convey the original meaning. But now that I'm starting to interject my own narrative into the story, where there are certain concepts that I don't think necessarily bend as easily in Latin, I start to find that the translations get taken over more and more by my own inner narratives. So I'm no longer necessarily sticking strictly to translating the words of the song, but using the original narrative of the song as sort of a matrix from which I sort of interject my own program into the story, something that's based in my own personal experience, something that's based in some even thought that I've had that the song reminds me of. And so that's what I started to shift to. So in this particular case, it wouldn't necessarily even be that the majority, like a broad audience, would be the people who I'm primarily reaching out towards. In this case, it would be more of, I'm reaching out to people who do in fact value the speaking of Latin, who do practice it on a regular basis, and who would be invested in actually listening to and understanding the lyrics. Because that's where a lot of this personal expression, what it hinges on, people understanding the lyrics. And so I started to get a slightly smaller scope, with a much more personal touch involved in this project. So the methods. This was outlined by my good friend Stefano Vittori. The three people who helped me, who were on my committee, are Chris Maccabee, Dr. Chris Maccabee, Dr. Stefano Vittori, and also Dr. Grossbeck, and I appreciate their help immensely. And Stefano was the one who, Dr. Vittori was the one who outlined this particular process for me, just in the middle of trying to understand what I was initially writing, which wasn't totally clear due to my own ignorance of the Latin corpus. So the first thing that we would need to do, that we normally established, was I would write grammatically correct prose of the song. I wouldn't necessarily worry about meter. I wouldn't worry about rhyme. I would just try to make sure that the sentences in Latin that I was writing were correct. From that point, I would write out a metrical structure, a metrical scheme, in order for that would then later be mapped onto using the grammatically correct prose. So it would be sort of like fitting two puzzle pieces together. You would get the meter together and then some content that would make sense, and then sort of try to match them together. And then once that final product was developed, then there would be embellishments added on top of that, be that rhyme or any of the other artistic concerns that I'll describe a little bit more in detail in the context of each song. And this is something that we were able to go through when it came to the first song that we translated together successfully, Somos Novios. But as the time sort of got a little bit shorter, we had to go for a bit more of an abbreviated version of this process. So what I did was, at this point, I had already written all of the schemes for the schemata for all of the meters of each song, mapping out. And to give a bit more context for that, when I say meter, I mean that Latin normally uses phonemic vowel length. So you have long and short syllables. And this was capitalized on by all of the Roman poets and even beyond the classical period. So in order to make Latin fit well with a translation of a song, normally what you have to do is figure out which syllables in the original lyrics would correspond to a short or long vowel or syllable, and then write your Latin translation as such so that it would fit the rhythm of the original song. It wouldn't feel disruptive. And so that's what I ended up writing. I wrote those schemata, and then in this more abbreviated version, I would have to consider all of the embellishments, all of the correct grammar, everything at the same time. And Stefano was integral in making sure that all of my sentences actually made sense, because there were many times when they did not. And I am so happy that he was a part of this process to facilitate ultimately what would be our larger audience's understanding of the text. And so with that being said, we can actually start moving to the illustratio, which would be an actual demonstration, an actual portrayal of how I started to mix in my own personal programs, my own, what I called during the process, intervening narratives into each song. Each of these is sort of a personal story, personal thought, personal theory that I then worked into the lyrics of the song. So I don't even necessarily, so I use the word translation a bit tentatively. I would even be a bit more okay with saying maybe interpretation, even though that's not maybe necessarily a technical use of the term. It still captures this idea of the variation. So that's what I would be describing here. So the first song that we translated was Somos Novios, and the Latin name that we had decided on, me and Stefano, was, excuse me. Pardon me. Don't know who this number is. So the first song that we translated successfully was Somos Novios, as I said. And so what I decided, the intervening narrative, the narratio that I decided to pursue in the course of writing or helping translate this song, was playing between the boundaries between Latin and the Romance languages. And so in Per de Amantes, which would translate as to certainly lovers, I started to play with this idea of the relationship between Latin and the daughter languages being seen as more of a love story than necessarily a parent-child relationship. So the rationale for this particular song was, as I started to think about this a little bit more, and I have to thank Dr. Delgado for helping me to think a bit more intently about this. I think that one of the main reasons, on top of the pragmatic concerns that I had while choosing the songs that I would actually translate, is that a lot of this also has to do with a sort of self-expression. It's an implicit invocation of my own identity as a Spanish speaker. I am attempting to by the very inclusion of this song, signal to other Latinos in the Huirites community that I also am aware of these particular, I guess you might call them cultural references, because Somos Novios is a fairly well-known song. It is a fairly popular piece. And so by invoking the idea that I know this song as well, it's an attempt of mine to try and legitimize my tie to the community at large. On the other hand, the specific comment on identity that I'm using in this particular, that I'm trying to pursue in this course of this particular song, is, like I had said before, this fascination with the mysticism between ancient times and modernity. I'm invoking that same fascination, that same mysticism here, but when it comes to a sort of mutual Latino identity, the idea of Latinity still being continued up to this day. And I'm trying to blur the lines between Spanish and Latin as a way to demonstrate that point. This is actually something that is not new. There was a long period, well, not a long period of time, but during the 16th century, you would have people in Spain, such as Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who would write bilingual poems specifically for this purpose of demonstrating how Spanish retained the figura of Latin. They would use strategic bivalent Spanish, which is basically using words that belong to both the lexicon of Spanish and Latin, claiming essentially that they have the same meaning, and then using that same meaning to convey this idea that Spanish has not lost its connection to the old empire. I want to step further with that by also including reconstructions of Old Spanish. So I would look up different resources to find out how there were different lingual shifts in pronunciation and grammatical structures as Proto-Romance in the Iberian Peninsula translated into, transitioned into what we would consider Spanish now. And the larger comment on identity that I'm essentially making then is that all of these particular transformations count as Latinity or Hispanidad in one sense or the other. Now, this is kind of a stretch because even the concept of Latinity, Latinitas, is a bit more rigid in the sense that it normally is not just talking about what is Latin-like, but what is good Latin, period. And so what we might consider good Spanish may, from the eyes of history, or at least from the Romans, may not necessarily have been seen as the best Latinity. So I'm stretching the idea of what Latinity is, of what Hispanidad is in this entire process. But I'm trying to, at the very least, make sure that it can be understood in both languages so that it can make that larger point of a sort of unity between the languages. And one of the primary issues that I had in this whole process was actually making the Latin and the Spanish sound good together. I did want to capitalize off of a sort of level of dissonance, but I still wanted them to sound alike. And during this first particular verse in which I'm singing with another young lady who helped me do a duet of this particular song, I can very well notice that there is a strong sort of dissonance between the Latin and the Spanish, even though in that particular verse specifically, I'm trying to make them fit together. So that was one thing that I had to that was very interesting to learn, how easy it is to create how easy it is to make both languages sound foreign to the other. And then of course, in the same process, I wanted to make sure that even though I am allowing the Latin to give way to Spanish, in fact, fully switching into Spanish at times, I still wanted to retain some sense of Latinity so this not just comes off as Spanish with Latin veneers, which would have been common during medieval times, but I still wanted to go a step further and actually make it make sense in both languages, even grammatically. So continuing on with this theme of personal expression, I capitalized off of the narrative of Besame Mucho, which Stefano has suggested this name as well, et unum, to describe a personal experience of a sort of misunderstood romantic sexual tension that I had with somebody. Now, I do want to also provide a bit of a warning as we progress through this. The slides are going to get increasingly personal to me. So just, I guess, as a cautionary note. So when it came to this particular song, again, a lot of this had to do with the rationale for the song was, again, invoking a sort of Spanish speaking identity. I am intentionally choosing a song that is popular, that is old, classic, as a way to demonstrate the larger point of, hey, I'm a part of the Spanish speaking community as well. It's also the pragmatic concern of this song is very singable. It's not too difficult. But one of the concerns that I also had while translating it into Latin is that it does have this sort of reminiscent feel of Catullus 5, in which the poet Catullus is talking to his lover Lesbia and saying, for lack of a better phrase, and it's appropriate here, besame mucho. He's asking her to kiss her a lot. So there's this strong tug that I could borrow from that vocabulary as a way of conveying the same meaning. But I intentionally chose to not draw from that particular literature like it, because I was wanting to capture more along the lines of my own sense of frustration, my own sort of desperation. The reason why this is called et unum, which means and one, more literally, is because internally I was confused and was looking for some sort of confirmation of this person's interest potentially in me. And I was tormenting myself is a strong term for it, but I was constantly mulling over that and internally petitioning for at least one particular signal. So this is sort of contrasts with the words of Consuelo Velasquez when she was saying, kiss me a lot. I'm simply asking for something a lot simpler, but then also a lot more dubious. Nothing happened as a result of this, but I think that one of the primary difficulties that I had in writing this particular translation was the preparation before it. And I think that was a constant theme in all of these songs, was understanding my mentality in the narrative that I was invoking well enough so that I would be able to concisely describe it in the context of a song that gives me so little space to actually describe fully what it is that I'm feeling, what it is that I was feeling at that time. And so this is actually something that, again, carries over into the next piece that I translated, Dinero, which has a very interesting story behind it as well. Because for a good bit of time, I was caught in a lot of expenditures on pornography, on cam girls, and I continued to do this for 6 whole semesters, not really understanding fully what I was actually pursuing and why. And in the midst of that, around 2017, which is when this particular song came out, I found this song and I loved it. I absolutely loved it because on one hand, again, we have this particular invocation of Spanish-speaking identity. I am of Latino heritage, at least by way of my grandmother on my dad's side. And so this seems like a way of exploring this side of a passionate, tragic story. The narrative behind Dinero itself, the original lyrics, talk about a man who has given all of his money to a particular girl. So this resonated for obvious reasons. But as I continued to think about this, before I even thought about translating this particular song, as I continued to think about my experience, I couldn't just avoid a certain level of personal responsibility that I had to take in this. I wasn't being robbed. I was willingly giving money to people at a rate I could not sustain. So as I thought about this, I thought about translating the song in terms of a realization of humility. That's how I tried to, that was the primary shift that I attempted to take in the course of the song. I was focusing less on the narrative that is used in the original lyrics of this girl is taking my money, and focusing a bit more intently on how I could essentially convey this idea that I am giving this person money for no reason. And this song presented its own challenges, particularly because of the nature of what I was describing, the idea of giving your money to a woman for no reason, or to any person who there might be some sort of sexual interest in, isn't uncommon. I'm sure there are plenty of texts that are written about this, even in the corpus for Latin. The primary issue is that the medium that I was describing this happening on is on the internet, and the internet, strictly speaking, does not exist in Rome. Now, we do have words in at least the Living Latin vocabulary, Living Latin, to describe things that do occur on the internet. We do have words like retiales, rete, but the idea of even simple things like account, you can find yourself getting into fights over how to best render these terms. So that was one particular struggle that I had to overcome, and the way that I overcame that. Okay. I apologize again. The room that I'm in, it has this particular phone. So the way that I overcame this, because even the first line of this song, I am discussing the idea of logging into a particular account. So the way that I resolve this is by using the word persona, which would in a more figurative way mean mask or character. And based on my understanding of how a user account works in the context of a computer, the relationship that I drew was in the same way that a user account sort of represents a real person's relationship to the resources of the computer. A persona, or a character, represents the actual player's relationship to the world of resources that are contained within a particular theatrical work. So that was the connection that I'm drawing there. But again, this is still a bit of a challenge, because it's a stretch in one sense that requires me to depend on people's, I guess, imagination on being able to make a connection on what specifically I'm trying to convey when I say something like, I take up my mask. Another difficulty that I guess you could say was in invoking the idea of Gran Tamato. He was actually someone who got in legal trouble over the same thing, except he went so far as to kill his family as a way of establishing his habits. I never necessarily got to that point, as many of you more likely know, but because I'm here, but I invoked him in the context of this particular song, because I think that one of the other reasons why I started to be drawn to this particular piece, especially when 2017, when I first heard it, was there was a certain level of shame that revolved around this particular expenditure. And I think that Grant, he embodies, I think for a lot of people, or at least he embodied for me, what being too given to fantasy ultimately leads to, and what social incompetence ultimately results in, which is a sort of reclusive, heartless, unempathetic person who is someone who can be despised, especially because this person, due to their own selfishness and social incompetence, becomes toxic. And in this case, he became financially destructive and then physically destructive. And so I try to distinguish myself, at least rhetorically speaking, in the context of this song. In the introduction is when I actually invoke him, saying that whilst he killed or spent his money and his family, I only spent my money. But this is really at a deeper level of speaking on a certain shame that would sometimes revolve around what others might think should such information be divulged. And I think the reason why I'm divulging it now is because it's a certain level of reflection and honesty that becomes cathartic in its own way, which in fact is the inspiration for the name of what I wanted this particular collection of songs to be, Cathartica, Catharticum. And another bit of references that I made was initially when I came up with this whole project, I wanted to make each of the songs, the accompaniment, Roman-like. But as I tried to pursue that, I realized that I did not have the technical skill or the resources to do that. So what I did was, in the context of this song, I drew on this group Sunalia, and they actually create recreations of Roman music, at least what they think it might have sounded like. And I used two pieces and sort of interwove those pieces into the accompaniment for Dinero. And those songs are Ludi Interbana Atque Nubas, which would translate as the game between Pan and the nymphs, and also Venus, Venus. And so I felt that the titles, at the very least, fit thematically with the idea of what I was trying to convey, this idea of pursuit, this idea of lust that's sort of out of control, and then translating the lyrics to convey that. And then finally, the last song that I was able to, that me and Stefano managed to translate, I had titled De Fictio, and it is based off of Screamin' Jay Hawkins' song, I Put a Spell on You. And this is more of a reflection of the relationship, the sort of estranged relationship that I have with my dad. It's a bit better now, but there's still a context of it being estranged. And the interesting thing about this song is that I was not actually intending to sing this song at all. It was more of a late add. But at the time that I did add it, the relationship that I have with my dad was something that was on my mind a lot. And as I listened to this particular song, I found that there was a certain level of correlation that the emotion had behind it with a conversation that I remember having with my dad when I was around 12 years old. I'd never grown up with my father, and this was around the same time when I'd first spoken to my 4 other siblings, at least over the phone. And then following that conversation, because I guess of a lull with me not having called back, that then started a particular conversation with my dad that went so far south as for him wanting to sort of probe my understanding of how I was conceived, the circumstances revolving the relationship between him and my mother. And I think the emotional climax of that conversation for me, which is what this particular song focuses on, was when my dad had asked me at a certain point, what do I want from him? And me being 12, not necessarily knowing how to answer that question, it's 12. It's a weird time, because at this point, a lot of people are asking you, what do you want to do with your life? And if you don't come up with a good answer, you feel guilty, because you feel like it reminds you of how kiddish you are. You haven't thought about it thoroughly enough. And it felt like one of those sorts of questions where I should have an answer. I should have thought about it more. And I didn't have a better answer beside I wanted him. Even in that moment, it felt like a melodramatic response, but I didn't necessarily know a better response to give. And my dad didn't really accept that answer. He had said that that because he himself was adopted, and given the fact that there are so many people who are adopted and taken care of well, then it's kind of stupid that you would want to have a relationship with your father just because he's your father. And that's the emotional loop, I guess you could say, that I start to fixate on in the context of this song. Because at 12 years old, I think what I realized at 22, reflecting on my 12-year-old self, was that I sort of thought that the response of I want you would sort of move my dad, and it didn't. In a way, sort of like the same way that a spell or a love potion, a love spell might move someone. There's a sort of surefire way that this should work. And in my context, the response that I felt in that moment should have worked, didn't. And I think that for a long time, I was confused over why it didn't work, and frustrated and angry. And one of the primary difficulties that I had with that is that the anger that I felt was not necessarily something that was isolated in that moment, but it's a bit more anachronistic. It's something that happens when I reflect over that experience in context with all of the other stuff that I learned about how my dad engaged with his children versus how he engaged with me, or how he engaged with other children as opposed to me. And the primary issue that I had in the context of this song was understanding, how do I actually convey all of that context concisely, without the entire song becoming this endless rant, because the song itself is very, very simple. And it doesn't provide a whole lot of space. One solution that I had was to sort of repeat the first verse to give myself more room. But towards the end of the project, I decided not to do that. But at the same time, it still posed a little bit of a challenge to really get at the heart of what it was about my relationship with my dad that frustrated me. And through the process of this song, I think I was able to actually, through the process of writing about it, not even yes, the translation, but even preparing for the translation again, that work of reflection started to help elucidate a lot of what I wanted to say, and then made the process of conveying that in Latin a lot easier. And so, yeah. So I think that one of the conclusions that I drew from this entire project as I pursued it, besides the fact that I need to read so much more of Latin literature if I want to actually pursue this more, which I do, but I think that a lot of this project unto itself is a big enactment of myself, of who I am, of the different sides of who I am, and a certain, and there's, I think, at the back, in the running in the background of each song is a certain level of becoming comfortable, more and more comfortable with these different parts of who I am, what I've done, what I've experienced, and what I've thought. It was, as the name suggests, it was a cathartic process, but it wasn't necessarily in the singing process that I found the greatest catharsis. I found it maybe when I was not even recording, but maybe singing the words to myself, because then I, especially in the context of Dinero, I had words that felt as if they matched what I felt, and the different stages, I guess you could say, of emotional growth and maturity that I went through to get to the point of understanding and reflecting on my experience and accepting responsibility for what I had done. I start to think about the invocation of Blackness, which I didn't necessarily cover before, but even the use of "I put a spell on you." There's a certain incongruence, because normally, at least what I hear in terms of Latin music, a lot of times it might be very, very operatic, which isn't bad unto itself, but sort of a combination of things like maybe Latin and what are considered or what are coded as Black music forms is something that's equally fascinating to me, because I am Black. And so having the opportunity to even apply Latin in the context of "I put a spell on you," on top of it being able to give voice to a certain sense of abandonment that I've had to deal with for many years, was a enjoyable process unto itself. And I think that what I'm doing here, what I accomplished in the context of this project, is I created this character for myself, Pernox. That's actually a YouTube channel name where I post different content in Latin. I created this particular character, and I'm enacting it through this character, through this collection of songs, as a way of sort of validating the already existent mysticism that I had with Latin. But part of that mysticism revolves around Latin being used in a very natural way. And for me, naturalness doesn't necessarily doesn't just stop at speed or the ability to speak with, I guess, grammatical correctness or even idiom. It's the ability to express something that is dear to you. It's when you get to the point of being able to not just recite literature that has already been written, but then reapply the language in the context of your own personal life. And that's what I attempted, at least, to do here, getting to the heart of what this impulse for the use of Latin is. And I think the next steps for this project would be, at the very least, to post what I have produced onto my YouTube channel and see what the response is from the larger Wheaties community, Wheatian community, and then continue to hone this particular skill so that I would be able to produce more content that sort of falls along the same lines of vulnerability and honesty, maybe not necessarily touching on the same things, but at the very least retaining this idea of making Latin a personal pursuit for me of expression and finding ways of invoking myself through the language. Even if that means modifying the work of other people slightly, to give myself a little bit of a platform to do that one. So that was a lot. I cannot see you guys, so actually kind of scared to put this down. So are there any questions?
Yeah, Chris, one of the things you said early on is that a lot of the target audience for this is the culture of non-academic Latin speakers. Now, there's people who love to speak Latin, learn more things about Latin, but are not learning about it in an academic background. Can you discuss this culture kind of ethnographically? In other words, are there, where I would never have guessed before I started working with you on this project that there are people who learned Latin on their own for the sheer joy of it outside of any kind of class. Is it an international community? Is it an American community? Is it, what is the size of it? What are their backgrounds? What are their academic? In other words, are they studying other things in academia like chemistry or something? Can you talk about the culture generally?
Luki, tu podes descrivere fortasse. No, but
Plane suis, Christopher. Well, you have, of course, a couple representatives of that community here. Three of us actually, and that's up to you and how much time you want to take. But I'll let you guide us, Chris, with what you want to do.
Well, the community is very eclectic. There are a lot of people. We do learn the language. Thank you, yes. But no, we do learn the language in a very academic setting. We normally are interested in a variety of languages. We do come all across the world. There are people who are from Australia, China, Jordan. I forgot in the particular video, but how do we describe this? There are people who are maybe toddlers. I don't know how old Juliola is, but there are people who are toddlers who are learning the language, who her father has sometimes brought her to the particular group and she speaks to us. There was one particular time when she actually apparently had watched the first cover that I had done of Havana, and she was notifying her father that this guy sings Havana in Latin. And so that was incredibly precious. So we do have a very wide age range of people who are learning the language. I find that a lot of the people who are learning it primarily in a non-academic sense, they tend to be a bit younger. So we aren't necessarily, because it seems, I guess, more the conventional way to teach Latin is normally through academia. You're not supposed to speak it, you're supposed to recite, but a lot of the people who I interact with on a weekly basis to speak Latin with, we don't necessarily subscribe to that. We speak it regularly. We also use this particular book called Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which teaches Latin through itself, and it doesn't actually have any other language. That I'm a part of groups there's a particular Facebook group that I'm part of, Aprender Latin en Latin, and you have people who are using this particular book to learn the language. It's a very large, it's fairly large, not necessarily, it's fairly large.
Wow.
So, Chris,
yeah,
what comes next after? I mean, you're graduating. You have done work in so many fields. Often when we always have to ask this question when people present, and normally we have some idea where they're going. You could be anywhere. I have absolutely no idea because your talents are so varied and so strong. What comes next? What are you going to do?
Survive. I am not totally sure. I'm entering cybersecurity training on January 1st. And so that was another thing. I'm also having to finish up some capstone stuff. But other than that, I'm not sure. What comes next is hopefully having the opportunity to make more content like this because I enjoy it thoroughly.
So
So, you go
Go
first,
ahead.
Dr. Hawkins.
No.
Absolutely not. You go first.
Well, I'm wrapping up. So if you don't ask now, you don't get a chance.
Oh, okay. You mentioned earlier how, something that I this is weird because it's kind of a personal question, but this was a very cathartic process for you, so I hope you don't mind. You, for one of your songs, you used De Ficciones as the title. And I'm sure that you were aware, but I'm not sure the audience does, the history of De Ficciones in Roman Latin culture. But could you elaborate on why you chose that for the title of that song?
Well, I actually, as luck would have it, I came across the term very recently, like a few days before I actually chose it. And the reason why is because with a defixio, it's a curse. And the reason why is because defixio, it means it's in a more literal sense, it means to bind to someone. It's this idea that you're binding a curse to someone. And the reason why I chose that was because on one hand, the idea of casting a spell is already in the song, but also because this is a song in a very real way about my anger. It's about wanting to question and challenge my father on a lot of points where I feel that there has been arrogance or mistreatment of me. I even feel it now. So in a lot of ways, even though it doesn't contain any specific ill wishes for him, the theme of being upset, disappointed, and confused and sad is what runs in the background. And I think that's really at the heart of a lot of the ficciones, even in ancient times, a sense of being betrayed and wanting to address that.
Cool. And if I may have a secondary question?
Yes.
So, persona, when it comes to personas and masks, you started bringing it up with using it as an account. So, just because I know the etymology of persona as it comes through from Latin, it got me kind of thinking about masks in general. So, I'm kind of the opinion that everybody is wearing a mask at all times, and that we are all presenting a part of ourselves that we want other people to see to the outside world, because you can never really know a person truly. You're always knowing a mask. So is this, especially with the cathartic nature and the deeply personal nature of some of these songs, how is that relating to, if we use this mask metaphor, this persona metaphor, how is that advancing your sense of self through your persona?
I think, if anything, it's a sort of abandonment of persona in my case, because one of the primary issues when it came to Dinero in particular is that I think that the cognitive dissonance that I felt was this idea that I'm a very disciplined and clean-cut individual and above such things. And in fact, I'm not. And so I ended up having to be honest about that. I think there's a certain level where this comes even in the same thing with I Put a Spell on You with Defixio, because growing up, I remember not liking the idea that my dad's absence affected me. I felt that it was weak. And this is a certain level of, I think what I realized at the time when I was 12 is that I was willing to abandon coming off as strong, and then it didn't work. I think that was the part that also bothered me as well about that exchange that I had with my dad. I was putting myself in a position of vulnerability, only to still be betrayed again. And so this is a sort of revisiting of that it does affect me. It does matter. Y también si hay otra pregunta en español, también pueden preguntarme si quieren.
Simon? Sorry, were you?
I was going to say it's wonderful to have so many people turning out for this, and it is just so powerful to see the intersection of a variety of communities, scholars, former Donaghy scholars, current Donaghy scholars, the Spanish language community, the Latin language community, the music community. I'm not sure who else I'm missing, but it really is impressive. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out to this, and thank Chris for doing something which has been so powerful and emotional and demanding at multiple levels. So I'd like to thank you very, very much. Dr. Scott, you want to say anything else in conclusion to all of this?
No, just it's wonderful. So many people here. Chris, I know you've been passionate about this and working on this for a long time. And after we saw what you did with Havana, I know we were very encouraging of you to continue to pursue this, because it was really something different and interesting. And I like to see you use your creativity. We're excited to see what you do next. And we would just want to thank everybody for joining us.
My pleasure. I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Good job, Chris.
Thank you. Yes.